Welcome back class to our course Mechanical Behavior of Materials. So today we are going to talk about impact testing. Okay. So the first question which comes to mind is why we are studying impact testing. Okay. So if you remember when Professor Shashank Setra was discussing about tensile testing, he must have mentioned to you that the strain rate what we use during tensile test is around, say, in the range of 10 to the power minus 2 to 10 to the power minus 4 per second, right? But there will be many applications where the strain rate will be much higher than what we use in tensile test, right? And if that happens, the behavior of the materials is also going to significantly change. Okay, especially say impact testing. So impact testing also has a very high strain rate. Okay, so in that scenario, the materials behavior is going to change, and that is one of the reasons why we need to study impact testing. Okay, so materials behavior change during very high strain rate. Okay, and in impact testing we have a very high strain rate we use. So this is say impact testing, one of the examples. Impact loading. Okay, you must have heard the name impact, right? So when something is being impacted, the strain rate at that time is very high. Okay? So this is the reason we need to study impact testing. How material is going to behave during impact testing, impact loading, as well as what are the different tests one can perform to measure the material's behavior. Okay, so in fact, when your strain rate is very high, a material tends to behave brittle, tends to show brittle type of behavior, especially if the temperature is low. Okay, so we are going to also study about DBTT, which is ductile to brittle transition temperature. Okay, so during impact loading or when you have high strain rate, a material can behave, can show the properties like a brittle material is going to show. Okay, so a ductile metal tend to show brittle behavior. Okay, so overall, if you see, when I say that a ductile material can tend to become brittle, there are three ways a ductile material can become brittle. One is high strain rate. Second is low temperature. Third is triaxial stress. So you have presence of notch, etc. Okay. So this will increase brittleness. So if you have a high strain rate, if you are testing at high strain rate, and the test is being conducted at say low temperature, and the material, the sample specimen contains some notch etc., which can generate triaxiality. Okay, so if these three combinations are there, material tends towards brittleness. And you will see eventually that when you do the impact testing, you are going to have all these three criteria, okay, in the impact testing itself. So for now, remember that when we do impact testing, we are going to measure something called notch toughness. Or impact toughness. So you already know about the toughness. So the energy, what we measure in the impact testing, we call it as notch toughness or impact toughness. Okay. So one more thing you have to note that impact testing is more of a qualitative nature, means it can be used as a comparison method. Okay, it's not an absolute value. It's not a material property. It can be used for as a comparative study or a comparison between different materials. Okay, so now let's understand how do you do impact testing. Okay, so what equipment you use. So here I am showing you the equipment what we have in our lab. Okay, so you have scale here. You can see this is your pendulum or hammer. You can see, okay. Somewhere here, which you cannot see, you have an anvil where you are going to place the sample, and I am going to show you how you place the sample. I am also going to show you the sample dimension, which is standard, and there are two different type of methods we use in impact testing. Those will be discussed today. Okay. So your hammer will be placed here on the top, and then it will be released. It will come down, and in the anvil, on the anvil, you will place the sample. Your pendulum is going to hit the sample. Okay, it is going to break it, and then you are going to see some value in the scale, and that value you have to know, that will be called as impact energy or impact toughness or notch toughness. Okay, so this is very simple equipment which we use for impact testing. Okay, so basically remember, you are going to have a pendulum, then scale, then anvil where you are going to place the sample. So you can do at room temperature or high temperature or low temperature, because we are going to talk about DBTT, so low temperature. Okay, so here I have shown another schematic. So you have pendulum here, okay, hammer, and you have a sample, just for your understanding, okay, which is placed on the anvil. You are releasing the hammer, it fractures the sample, and then you are going to achieve a different height of h dash. So initially the sample or hammer height was h. After it has fractured the sample, the height is h dash. You can note that h dash is less than h. That means some of the energy has been lost. One of the ways to lose the energy is your friction, air friction, right? But some of them will be also lost by imparting energy to the sample, which will lead to the fracture, isn't it? Okay, and that is what we measure. Okay, so we can write the energy consumption absorption computed from the difference between h and h dash. Okay, so that will be impact toughness It will be given as mgh minus s dash. Okay, and typically unit is in joule. Okay, so the initial energy is mgh, final energy is mgh dash. You have to take the difference between the two, and that will be given as impact toughness. Okay, so some of the energy has been given to the sample for deformation. Okay, and if it is completely brittle, for fracture. Okay, so this is how we perform the impact testing. Okay, now what are the different tests? So this is a general concept of performing impact test. So we have two different methods. One is Charpy and another one is IJOD. Okay. So the basic difference between Charpy and IJOD will be the placement of the sample on the anvil, and you will see that. Okay. So before that, both are standard tests. So you are going to have standard sample, okay, dimension. Then in the sample, you are going to have notch. And this is the reason I mentioned, right? When you do impact testing, eventually you are going to observe the three criteria I mentioned, right? Notch, low temperature, and high strain rate. High strain rate is inbuilt. It is inherent to the impact testing. That is always there. Notch is inbuilt in the sample as part of standard. And you will see in some time from now that we are going to do test at different temperatures. So at some point of time, we will be testing the sample at low temperature also. So all the three criteria are going to met during impact testing. Okay. So this notch is actually going to provide you stress concentration. And in general, in India, we prefer Charpy test. Okay, so that is the mostly widely used impact testing out of these two in India. Okay, so in India, Charpy test is widely used. Okay, so let's see the sample dimension now. So this is the sample, how it looks like. Okay. So it's a square shaped sample. You can see the cross section is square shaped. Okay, and this dimension is 10 millimeter. This dimension is also 10 millimeter, and this distance from the notch is 8 millimeter. Okay, and this is the notch here. Okay, so in this region in front of the notch, you are going to have stress concentration. Okay, and this is the standard sample and standard dimension. For the notch, we have 45-degree V notch. So it's a V shape and the angle is 45-degree. And since this is 8 millimeter and the overall dimension is 10, so the notch length is 2 millimeter. Okay. Now, IJOD and Charpy, I just mentioned that depending upon the placement of the sample on the anvil, we will name them either Charpy or IJOD. So this is how we place the sample in Charpy test. So you have anvils here, right? So this is your anvil. This is your sample. And your hammer, it is going to turn from this side. Okay. So this is your hammer. So you are going to release the pendulum from this side and it is going to hit the surface which is opposite to the notch. Okay. And your notch will be placed like this on the side of the anvil. Okay. So you are going to see fracture occurring in this particular region here. So this is how sample is placed on in the Charpy test. Now this is the placement for IJOT test. Okay, so you have anvil here. As usual, this is your sample. Okay, notch you can also see. Okay, now your hammer, you are going to hit the sample at this particular point like this. So this is your hammer. Okay, so if your sample is like this, you are going to hit on the top here. Hammer will go like this. Okay, so now hammer is going to hit on the same side as of the notch. And if you compare with the Charpy test here, hammer is going to hit on the opposite side of the notch. Okay, so this is the placement of the sample on the anvil. Both are different in the different test, IJOT and Charpy test. Okay. Okay, so now when we do this test, we can do a different temperature, isn't it? So room temperature we can always do. So whatever I just showed you till now, we were assuming that we are doing at room temperature. So you can do the test at different temperature and then you can measure the corresponding energy in the scale, in the equipment. Okay. So with respect to temperature, you are going to obtain different notch toughness or say impact energy, okay, or impact toughness. So what you can do, you can plot impact energy on the y-axis and temperature on the x-axis. Okay, and with different temperature you are going to obtain different impact energy. So you are going to get a curve which will look something like this. Something like this. Okay, so as you decrease the temperature, your impact energy will be decreasing. Okay, that means it is going towards more brittleness, isn't it? Okay, so first thing what you observe here is decreasing the temperature. So to decrease the temperature, it is going to decrease impact energy. So lower the temperature, your impact energy is going to be low. That means it is going towards more brittleness. Okay. So here at very high temperature, you are going to have ductile behavior. Somewhere here you are going to have misbehavior, and at a particular temperature you are going to see a transition from ductile behavior to brittle behavior. Okay, and that particular temperature is called DBTT. So below certain T, the mode of failure or fracture is brittle. Okay, some temperature here where the mode of fracture is going to be brittle, and we are going to call as DBTT. One of the criteria you are going to see that DBTT definition is going to have different criteria will be used to define DBTT. Okay, so one of the criteria is this, and so what we do, we can see now the fracture surface. So you have fractured the surface. Okay, now look at both the fracture surface. We have two surfaces, right? Two parts of your samples. Okay, so you look at the fracture surface, and by looking at the fracture surface also, one can determine whether it has brittle behavior, or brittle fracture, or ductile fracture, or combination of brittle and ductile fracture. Okay, so if your fracture surface is granular, it shows shiny texture and cleavage. These characteristics are for brittle behavior. Okay, and if it is of say shear character, fibrous, and the texture is dull, then these will be your characteristics for ductile behavior. Okay, so by looking at the fracture surface, if it is very shiny, one can say that, oh, it is brittle. Okay, and if it is dull, then it is ductile. And if it is a combination of both, then yes, it is having both mixed type of failure. It has some amount of brittle failure, some amount of ductile failure. Okay, so this is how we classify by looking at the fracture surface. And I have here one example. Okay, this was done in our lab, and here your temperature is increasing or say decreasing in this direction. So this is at low T. So if I mark say T1, T2, and T3, so we have samples. Okay, and then what we did impact testing at three different temperatures. So we did at T1 and T2 and T3, and then at these three different temperatures we took the photographs using mobile. Okay, and now we are looking at the surface. So here your T1 is less than T2 and T3. Okay, now if you look here very closely, you can say that T3 is looking dull and T1 is looking shiny. Similarly, T1 has a cleavage type. The sample is very flat, okay, as compared to T3. So we can say that this type of behavior is your ductile type, and this one is more towards brittleness. Okay, and in between two, you will see that you are going to have combination of both. Okay, but even in T2, you will see that it is more towards brittleness compared to ductile behavior. Okay, because more shiny surface. So the fraction of shiny surface and the dull surface will change depending upon the temperature. It is not like 50-50. Okay, it might be 90-10 or 10-90 depending upon the temperature. Okay, so you have two criteria to quantify or say measure DBTT. One is based on the impact energy, and second is based on the fracture surface observation. Okay, and we will use these two to define what we call as DBTT. Okay, so there are different criteria to define DBTT, and both are based on either energy versus temperature curve or fracture appearance versus temperature curve. Okay, so now we will learn about criteria for transition temperature. Okay. So here we have two terms, if you see here. So one is your impact energy versus temperature, and another is your appearance, fracture surface appearance. Okay, fracture appearance versus temperature. So we'll use both of them. So the red one we have seen before, right? It is fracture toughness, impact energy versus temperature. So x-axis is always temperature here. So here we have, say, impact. Let me change the color so that, so red one is your impact energy. Okay, and the black one here is your fracture surface appearance. That means in this case percentage cleavage fracture. Okay, so if you look at the fracture surface, you should be able to calculate how much percentage of the fracture surface area is of cleavage type. That means brittle behavior sort of, right? So that percentage you have to calculate and plot with respect to temperature, and if you do that, you are going to get black curve, and red one is the impact energy we are measuring from the equipment. Okay, so there are two ways to define it. One is based on the impact energy, which comes from the equipment, and second one is the fracture surface percentage cleavage fracture calculation, which you will be doing by looking at the surface, or say in low mag microscope. Okay. Now let's define some temperatures here. So we have, let me use blue color. I don't see blue here. Okay. So one is your T1, which will be this particular point. This point here is called T1. Okay. Which is fracture transition plastic, or the probability of brittle failure is negligible. So this is T1. Then we have T2, which will correspond to a point here. I will discuss all this one by one. T2. So T2 corresponds to a temperature where you are going to observe 50% cleavage fraction. Okay, and that corresponds to this particular point here in the x-axis. Now we have T3, which is the temperature average of upper shelf and lower shelf. Okay, so if you see, this is your upper shelf and this one is your lower shelf. Okay, so somewhere here you're going to have average of upper shelf and lower shelf region. So this temperature will be called as T3. Now there is one more, two more. One is corresponding to 20 joule impact energy. This will be called as temperature T4, which is defined as ductile transition temperature. Okay, and the last one is T5, which is called as nil ductility temperature, where the fracture will be predominantly, or say 100% cleavage, which will correspond to this particular point, T5. Okay, so you see T1, T5 and T2 will be calculated from the black curve. So T1 corresponds to a point where you are not going to observe brittle failure. Okay, or cleavage percentage is almost 0. T5 is a temperature where cleavage percentage is almost 100%, and T2 is a temperature where you are going to observe 50% cleavage and 50% ductile behavior. Okay. Now T3 and T4 will be based on the red curve, impact energy versus temperature curve, where T3 is the average of the upper self temperature and the lower self temperature, and T4 is called ductile ductility transition temperature, which is defined as a temperature where energy, impact energy is 20 joule, a specific value. Okay, so this is how we define the transition temperature. There are different criteria. Okay, and one of the most famous out of these is ductile transition temperature, DTT, and the reason is because it is very simple. You have to just plot impact energy versus temperature, and wherever you are going to get 20 joule as impact energy, that temperature will be called as DBTT. Okay, or in this case, ductile transition temperature. So let me write down one by one. So first one is T1, which is called FTP, or fracture transition plastic, and it says that the probability of brittle fracture is negligible. Okay, this is your T1. And you can see it right in this plot here. So we are using black plot, and you can see that the percentage cleavage fracture is almost 0. Okay, and that is what it says, the probability of brittle fracture is negligible. So that is T1. Next is T2. It is the temperature at which you are going to observe 50% cleavage and 50% shear. So ductile and brittle type behavior. Okay, and this temperature is called as FATT, which is fracture appearance transition temperature. Okay, so this is your T2, which corresponds to this particular point where you are going to observe 50% cleavage and 50% shear. Now T3, so T3 is a temperature which is the average of upper and lower half cell. So this is your T3, okay, and in the plot this corresponds to this. Okay, and I mentioned, right, this is your lower half cell and this is your upper half cell here. Okay, now next is T4, and this is the most famous among all these. It is called ductile transition temperature. And why it is most famous? Because it is the most simple one. Temperature DTT. Okay, so it is most accepted and the value will correspond to 20 joule. So you have to get the temperature at which your impact energy is 20 joule, and that will be defined as T4. Okay. Now last is T5, which is this point here. Okay, and it is called nil ductility temperature. Okay, so here you are going to observe no prior plaster deformation. Okay, so fracture with almost no plastic deformation. That means it is 100% cleavage. Okay, that is what we discussed. And you can also write probability of ductile fracture is negligible. Okay, below this. So we have 5 different criteria to measure transition temperature, and the most famous or most accepted is DTT, which corresponds to a temperature at which your impact energy is 20 joule. Okay. Now the last topic in this impact testing is the effect of crystal structure on DBT. So you have, say, FCC crystal structure or BCC or FCC. So how your curve is going to change. So that is what we are going to talk about now. So you have FCC, BCC, say SCP. So what is going to happen? Okay, so let me first plot it. So you can have a situation like this, okay, or say this one, another one, and the one which we have learned, something like this. Okay, so the red one here will correspond to low strength FCC SCP metals. Green one will correspond to high strength materials. And the blue one, which we have studied till now in this particular topic, is for low strength steels. So BCC. And X-axis is impact energy. And here you have temperature. Okay, so you are going to observe, you can observe either of these 3 plots. Okay, so the red one corresponds to FCC and SCP, low strength material. So there you are going to see that there is no, as such, no transition temperature, and the decrease in impact energy is not very significant. Okay, high strength materials by nature is brittle. Okay, mostly brittle. So you are anyway going to observe low impact energy. You can see the impact energy value is small in this region compared to the FCC material. Impact energy is going to be high. Okay, and here also you are not going to observe ductile transition temperature typically. Okay, but if you have steels type of materials, you are going to observe a transition temperature which we have discussed. So that is the blue curve here. Okay, So let me write very quickly. So low strength FCC metals such as aluminum, copper, okay, and most SCP metals, they are not going to experience. So do not experience transition temperature. So they do not experience transition, ductile to brittle transition. Similarly, if you talk about high strength materials, same thing. Okay, so they will not experience. So let me write here itself. Do not experience transition. But their impact energy is anyway low. Okay, so this ductile to brittle transition, this will be typically you are going to observe low strength steels, okay, where you are going to have BCC crystal structure. Okay, so this is what I wanted to discuss about impact testing. Okay, and remember that impact testing we are going to observe very high strain rate as compared to what we see in tensile testing. Okay, thank you.